Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to History and Systems of Psychology. We are week 8. We're right around midterms. I'm glad to see all of you in class today. We're going to begin by finishing up our video on Charles Darwin. After that, we'll do a brief discussion and then finish our chapter on Darwin himself. Okay? Great.
Darwin published 10 biological works, 6 of which were engaged with particular botanical problems, dealing with questions concerning devices for securing cross-pollination, as well as the operation of climbing plants. One concerned earthworms and their effect on the natural environment, and the other 3 concerned themselves with evolutionary biology. Many of these later works were designed to augment and complement the theory that he had presented in The Origin of Species, although they also contained some odd digressions into theories of sexual selection. The first of these was the variation of animals and plants under domestication. In this work, Darwin turned his attention to the significant variation which existed amongst domestic animals and included dogs, cats, and foals, examining and analyzing the variation which they exhibited. He maintained from this his original conclusion that evolution was a slow process which relied not upon sharp variance between members of a population, but on small, incremental differences which became increasingly potent in a species over a long period of time. Later in his life, Darwin presented the theory of pangenesis, which was his attempt to examine and explain the ways through which characteristics were transferred between members of a species. He posited that something called gemmules were transferred between beings through sexual reproduction, a theory which was, of course, erroneous, but which was nonetheless a valiant attempt to account for inheritance in the absence of any knowledge of DNA. Following his variations, Darwin worked on a new book, The Descent of Man, in which he sought to powerfully reject the idea that man had descended from Adam and Eve, and posited rather that they had developed over a great period of time through the process of natural selection. Darwin asserted that humans had descended from a form of ape-like primate, which may have originated in Africa, a theory which remains highly supported by more recent research conducted by academics such as Broom and Dart and Leakey. Many critics of the time were outraged at what they saw as his assertion that humans had monkeys as their ancestors, which was not, in fact, what he was arguing, since monkeys were the product of a period of evolutionary development which had been concurrent to that of humans. Darwin led his investigation with an examination of the similarities of humans and apes, and noted the similarity of the formation and operation of some organs and musculature between them, as well as the similarities in brain structure. He also noted several vestigial characteristics in humans, such as the embryonic formation of a vestigial tail, and that some humans possessed what later became known as Darwin's point, which manifests as a thickening of the helix at the tip of the human ear, an evolutionary trait connected to the pointed ear tips of several primates. Darwin also emphasized that humans and primates shared not only physical, but also emotional characteristics. He argued that apes demonstrated an advanced emotional maturity, which manifested itself in reason, imagination, and sense of morality, although he emphasized that, whilst recognizable as a distant embodiment of human-like intellect, that of mankind was doubtless greater. Darwin also dedicated a great deal of The Descent of Man to the topic of sexual selection, and argued that much of the struggle in nature was for reproduction. Mammals attempted to win out over one another for sexual engagement through physical combat, which enabled them to reflect shows of strength. He argued as well that for many species, the size of the male was an important determining factor in the sexual freedoms it could enjoy, and noted this as a significant factor in the mating behavior of animals such as the sea elephant, sometimes called the elephant seal. In birds, Darwin argued sexual preferences and choices for members of a given species were more often determined by visual displays. Male members of many avian species were more brightly colored than females, and their mating behavior often commenced with a dance or visual ritual, which enabled the male to display their feathers and plumes to a female. Darwin noted this behavior was particularly significant for birds of paradise and hummingbirds. Some of these ideas have since been discredited, such as Darwin's general assertion that animals were polygamous. We now know that many birds engage in monogamous relationships, and there have since been biological distinctions made between social and sexual monogamy, which Darwin confused with one another. Indeed, we now also know that colored plumage on birds often acts to defend territory and intimidate attackers, as much as, if not to a greater extent, than it serves in determining sexual relationships. These omissions informed Darwin's further general assertion that sexual reproduction within a species was almost solely determined by the choice of the female in sexual partners. This view has since been discredited, and we now know that many of these rituals are in fact mutual in allowing both partners to make a decision. In the final chapter of his book, Darwin turned to the sexually selective practices of humanity and asserted that, in this case, selection was almost always made by men, who, he argued, would choose a female partner based on several characteristics, such as their figure and facial structure. He indicated that many fashions attempted to augment desirable characteristics amongst humans, and for men, fashion reflected wealth and social status, which informed the choice that women made. These theories are, of course, very much of their time, and have been subject to countless criticisms from social scientists, and indeed, there is an obvious omission of several fundamental aspects of human social and sexual engagement, such as the importance of the formation of emotional bonds between sexual partners, and the fact that female choice in human sexual preference has been a constant throughout human history. Darwin's theory was important for the fact that it introduced the concept of displays as a form of choice information in sexual preference, although the field has advanced significantly in the intervening years. Emotions and their development were also of interest to Darwin, who noted that primates and humans shared several emotions and had a similar reaction to emotional stimulation, such as public shaming, and that both expressed more complex emotional responses, such as a desire for deliberate revenge when wronged. He pursued this field of study with his 1872 book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, in which he studied how emotions were expressed physically by certain species. He noted with interest the expressions of emotion in cats, horses, monkeys, and apes, as well as a plethora of other animals such as porcupines, hyenas, and kangaroos, leading him to conclude that emotional expression was innate to many animals. In his pursuit of data on genuine emotional expression in humans, Darwin focused his attention on the expressions of infants and inmates in asylums, obtaining photographs of facial expressions which he labeled and analyzed, concluding from this, and a study he conducted internationally, that despite culture and region, human emotional expression was largely common across the world, and many behaviors and modes of expression would be recognized between humans wherever they were from. Darwin further argued that these forms of emotional expression, as they occurred in animals, stemmed from a preparation for action. Swans demonstrating a state of anger with arched wings and two-footed propulsion. Dogs baring their teeth in distress, which stemmed from an evolutionary practice of preparing for action, and thus giving animals with these displays of emotion an advantage in their prospects of survival. Darwin also dedicated later books to the development of vegetables and plants, and argued against a prevalent view that some plants engaged in self-fertilization. The variation which existed in these species would have to stem from some degree of cross-pollination, which he wanted to further investigate. Some work had already been done on the subject, notably by Christian Konrad Sprengel, who had advanced the theory that flowers attracted bees and thus played a role in the process of reproduction and cross-pollination in his 1793 book Das entdeckte Geheimnis der Natur im Bau und in der Befruchtung der Blumen, which was groundbreaking work in the development of biological understanding, but received little acclaim during the author's lifetime. Darwin wished to build on this understanding through research which analyzed the reproductive processes of plants and the process of cross-pollination. He studied orchids in particular and the ways in which the proboscis of moths had developed to obtain the nectar contained within them. One genus he studied was the Coryanthes orchid, which was structured in such a way that bees would tumble into the center of the flower and become covered with pollen, which once they had crawled out, they would spread to other plants. The various and ingenious ways in which plants were adapted to the process of cross-pollination was a source of immense interest to Darwin and led him to describe them as beautiful adaptations, which could transcend in an incomparable manner the contrivances and adaptations of which the most fertile imagination of man could invent. Darwin examined these processes further in his later book, Effects of Cross and Self-Pollinization in the Vegetable Kingdom, which argued that there must be some innate value in the cross-pollination of vegetables, and that over time plants and pollinators such as bees become suited to one another through features such as the development of an elongated proboscis or a flower which allowed access to a certain species of bee. Darwin also advanced theories on the growth of plants and indicated that stems had the capacity to bend as they grew through the process of asymmetrical growth on one side of the stem, overtaking the rate of growth on the other side and thus pulling the plant around a curve. This process was often seen in plants which adapted themselves to make best use of light conditions, although it was a process which also took place at night, indicating that mechanisms beyond the reflexive response to light must play a role. Darwin's last book was produced in 1881 and concerned earthworms. He conducted much of this research in his home in Down House and erected a wormstone so that he might record the rate at which the stone descended into the earth, and thus how potent the influence of earthworms on the structural integrity of the soil in the lawn was. He conducted further experiments which allowed him to write about the anatomy, habits, and physiology of earthworms, and even analyzed the effect that music would have on their behavior, noting that a bass note played on a piano would send them into their burrows. Darwin, now late into his life, demonstrated that earthworms had caused the monoliths at Stonehenge to sink and thus appear far shorter than they were. He also showed that their actions were responsible for a Roman villa sinking so deep into the earth that it was too submerged to be affected even by invasive agricultural practices such as ploughing. This thesis, a little-known work by a man who is best remembered for his other research, nonetheless encapsulates the doctrine which was central to much of his work, that small, incremental actions and processes would, over time, come to have significant effects on the natural world. In the winter months of 1881 to 1882, Darwin experienced serious heart problems and was incapacitated more completely than he had been already. In February 1882, he wrote in a letter to a friend that he believed his course was nearly run, and on the 19th of April, he died, a short time after his 73rd birthday. Darwin was buried in Westminster Abbey and was carried to his grave by the President of the Royal Society, Huxley, Hooker, and Wallace, as well as several other notable persons, to be buried alongside Isaac Newton. Darwin was notable in his life for many things. The fact that a man with no formal scientific training would complete a voyage as testing as that undertaken on the Beagle, to then introduce one of the most powerful and influential models of biological development in human history, as well as a wealth of other botanical, paleontological, and geological theories which were groundbreaking in their own right, was truly remarkable. And he is today celebrated as the father of numerous scientific branches. The influence of Darwin's central theory of evolution cannot be overstated. The disruptive effect that this had on biological, scientific, religious, and social understanding remains truly significant across the world today, and he is often celebrated as a paladin of reason and scientific pathfinding. Darwin was characterized in great part by his humility, his dedication to his self-appointed task of scientific advancement, and his insatiable thirst for knowledge. We undoubtedly owe our modern understanding of our own origins and existence to him, and he remains one of the most celebrated scientists ever to have lived. What do you think of Charles Darwin? Does he deserve his reputation as one of the greatest and most influential scientists who has ever lived? Or should some of the credit for the theories of evolution and natural selection be at least in part shared with largely forgotten figures such as Alfred Wallace? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
And that is all. I hope that you enjoyed that. I thought it was a beautiful documentary with all of the pictures of the animals and the flora, fauna. I'd like to break you up into groups right now for discussion. So let's start here with 1. 2. Oh, sorry. Let's see.
3.
And then we'll go 1 again.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2.
3. Let's do 1, 2, 3 in the back. Everyone, what I'd like for you to do is get out a piece of paper and have someone be recording what you talk about. Make sure you put your names on top of the paper so I can give you credit for being here today, okay? There's a lot that we could talk about in that video. These are the 3 items I'd like for you to focus on in your group. The first is I'd like for you to discuss the top 5 takeaways in order of importance. After watching that video, what do you view as the overarching theme of the video, and what are other important pieces? So that's step 1. The next step is the role that sickness played in the voyage. You might ask yourself, well, if he hadn't slowed down because of the sickness, might he have raised a family? Might he have started studying earthworms? So what role might that have played? And then also the controversy surrounding his work. Okay? All right.
Are we all also allowed to like talk about stuff in the first half of the video?
Yes, so I'd love for you to consider, everyone, consider the video in its entirety, not just what we saw today. Okay, thank you for that question.
Because at that time period, that was like all new.
Sorry, you turned me off for a second so I could go on. How are you doing? Benefit from, let's say, 3 more minutes? Okay, great. Okay, let's wrap up. And which group would like to talk first?
You'll always talk first? All right. And this is our group 1, correct?
So the top 5 takeaways, we have just the theory of evolution in general.
Okay, and that would be the highest order of importance theory of evolution? Okay.
I think a lot of it, just order out of survival of the fittest.
Okay.
His later observation that genetic attributes contributable to sexual reproduction.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
In his case, in vivo experience really trumped any kind of formal education that he could have got.
One has a hard time imagining that he would make the sort of discoveries he did had he been pursuing most of his knowledge seeking behind a book, right, while reading a book. So the importance of life experience in terms of the learning process. Good. What else?
Our number 4 kind of tied in with 1, but like the origin of species and the descent of man.
Uh-huh.
Just having published those.
Right.
I think one of the things that he, which also kind of ties into our number 5, like he spent a lot of time
Uh-huh.
reviewing and organizing and kind of situating his thoughts and arguments for that hypothesis.
Right.
Thought it out ahead. He knew there would be a lot of pushback. He kind of organized it and organized an intelligent, well thought out argument for it before he just published it.
Sure, right. So he had all these findings. Can you imagine like his daily process of going through and finding fossils, finding different sorts of species, cataloging them day in, day out with his very regimented schedule? He had lots of things that he could present, but he needed to figure out what's the most thoughtful, palatable way for me to present this, because I know I'm going to get a lot of backlash. And the book talks about that careful pursuit of this idea of writing the book and publishing the book, and then when it comes out, being able to talk to people about, why his studies support this, because he got a ton of backlash from the church, right, and many other people.
Yeah. It wasn't in here, but I remember reading that it was one of the things he had a great deal of just emotional and spiritual and personal turmoil over, including like the work of a creator versus not.
Right,
So it was one of those, like, he really, because of his life experiences, like, he really struggled with, is this or is this not, like, guided by anything else?
Very good, good. Let's hear others, your takeaways, your most important point. Group 2.
One thing we talked about was cross-pollination and self-pollination in plants. How
Okay.
the different plants would adapt in order to make it so that way they could all be pollinated in more efficient ways. And then another thing we talked about was the theory of pangenesis, where it's the animals carry things down and pass it on to the next generation, which was like a step before DNA was discovered, and how that was something that led to the discovery of that idea.
Excellent. Ahead of his time there, and in many other ways as well. Other items from this group.
We talked about mating behaviors and how they talked about he would discuss how humans replicate it in certain ways, like the whole bright colors and shows. In order
Like
to
in what you're talking about, like in what they wear and the clothes.
how they would dress and how they would act in order to attract a mate. Kind
Okay.
of like the natural selection type behaviors. We also discussed earthworms and how his discoveries with those, and how they had led to, he theorized they had led to certain monuments sinking into the ground further, and then the role.
Does anyone find that amazing, or is it just me? The power of the earthworm, or actually many earthworms, right? Okay, excellent. Let's hear from our other group.
We talked about how he was very thorough and he always made sure that he had evidence to back his claims because he was so
Good.
controversial. He had to have that.
Sounds like some other people we've been studying recently, right? Evidence-based claims.
We also talked about the irony of his history of his education and how he struggled with that, and he was an average student, and yeah, we thought that was pretty important considering how important he is in our school now. You know?
Well, sure, and it sounds like he was someone who liked to have a good time too, like spend lots of time with friends, kind of goof off, and then all of a sudden he gets aboard this Beagle for this adventurous undertaking, and he writes out this rigid schedule, adheres to it, and it's very different than what you would have thought had you known him probably as an 8-year-old boy, right? Yeah. Good. Other things.
We talked about how he was buried next to Isaac Newton and Wallace, and how we kind of considered him to be like one of the greats, you know.
I don't think anyone's mentioned this. What was his view of slavery? So when he was sailing on the Beagle, he encountered slavery, which he'd not encountered before, right? He was from England. What was Darwin's view? This was from last week.
He was against it. He didn't.
Right, he was against it. He didn't understand it. He didn't understand why it was so common. And he also didn't understand when they would be on their voyage and meet inhabitants from other islands, Why are we giving them things like tea and fancy teacups? That's really not what they need to survive, right? So that's neglecting looking at someone's environment and looking at what they need from that. So he was very against slavery at a time when many people endorsed that idea. I wanted to make sure I made mention of that. There was a society that was mentioned at the beginning of the video on Thursday. Do you remember what that was called? It was a society where lots of the intelligentsia of the day, the deep thinkers, philosophers would organize. And I believe it was his grandfather, Erasmus, I think his grandfather's name was Erasmus Darwin, who organized this society. The Lunar Society for $100. Yay! All right, you too could be a member of the Lunar Society today. I'm not exactly sure what the qualifications are, but feel free to look that up in your spare time. Let's see. Trying to think of some other tidbits. How about just some fun tidbits maybe that you remember from the video that stood out to you?
His sister was like his first educator.
His sister was his first educator. I really like that. Yes. Okay.
I remember they talked about how he didn't get along with the captain, him and him. They would both argue and he almost left because of it.
Exactly. So he did come really close to leaving it. One thing that's mentioned in the textbook and was mentioned in the video is that he was a very kind person and easy to get along with. And so in that respect, he sounds a lot different than Wundt, right? Who wanted to sort of stick by himself. So I think it was that process of being able to get along, get past this person's personality, I want to go do something, that he was able to accomplish what he did. Anything else you'd like to mention? All right, let's look back at the start of chapter 6. I don't know how often, or I'm sorry, not how often, how much we've talked about his early life. Did we talk very much before we started the video? I can't really
I
recall.
don't think we did a whole lot.
No, the video touched a little bit on it.
Right. So let's go into that a little bit more before we go on with things and finish out the remainder of chapter 6. Darwin was born in 1809. He was born, I'll give you guys a moment to go back to your preferred seating, your preferred environment. All right, we settled? Good? All right. So again, he was born in 1809 in England. He was the fifth and next to last child of a very wealthy and distinguished family. His dad was one of the most highly paid physicians in England outside of London. What I thought was funny is that on page 211, the textbook talks about the fact that his father hated the sight of blood, and one of his reasons for being a physician was because it paid so well. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had been one of the most famous intellectual figures of his day. Listen to this: a doctor, inventor, poet, and general man of science. He had even formulated an early theory of evolution. So Darwin didn't just come out of this from thin air, right? There were some things that were already set in motion, some ideas that people he was related to were following at the time that planted a seed, as it were. I think this is a funny quote. It says on page 210 in the last paragraph, educated first at home and then at the nearby Shrewsbury School, young Charles was an indifferent scholar in the then standard classical curriculum. He recalled, "Nothing could have been worse for the development of my mind. The school as a means of education to me was simply a blank." He failed to impress his schoolmasters and once led his exasperated father to declare, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." All right, so pretty dramatic father. Two qualities that the text author talks about that Darwin had that helped him pursue his ideas and his ways of the ways that he collected his data is he had a really strong curiosity and love of nature. As a child, he collected lots of plants and shells and minerals. They said he did explosive experiments in a home chemistry laboratory, and that earned him the nickname Gas. So there you go. Maybe an extra credit question. All right. Was Darwin enthused when he went to medical school? Was he excited about medical school? Not really much at all. He was not excited. He understood. It said his father understood. I talked about the fact that his father hated the sight of blood. And so what was the idea? Darwin didn't want to do medical school, so what was he going to do then? Go into the clergy. That was the other idea that was there. So guys, please make sure that you're reading. This is on page 211. It says, Darwin's father proposed another change, that Charles move to Cambridge University and prepare to become an Anglican clergyman. Attracted by the prospect of becoming a country parson and pursuing natural history as an amateur, Charles accepted the plan. Okay, so he did that for a while. There was an academic curriculum that he enjoyed there. There was some emphasis on math, but he just didn't really flourish there either. So when he met Fitzroy, that was a pretty fateful day, right? He felt really have nothing to lose. I've tried out these things. Medicine is not really working as a career for me. I don't see myself becoming a clergyman, so why not set sail, right? And my family has the money for me to do this. And so a series of serendipitous events led to him being on the Beagle. All right, let's review in terms of some of the places that he traveled. What can you tell me about? Where were some places that he traveled?
Brazil.
He traveled in Brazil, right? In the Galapagos Island, he examined lots of different species of birds,
right? Spent specific time on a particular type of bird, which was what? The finch, okay? And he was interested in looking at the finch's beaks and seeing how those beaks had sort of morphed and changed in response to the geographic location where the finches lived and spent most of their time, so that they were best fit for the environment, be that the temperature, the sorts of plants that were around, vegetation, what have you. Did Darwin begin by looking at animals? That's probably an exam question. Where did he begin his studies? What did he begin examining?
Geology.
Right. So he actually was examining the geological layers of rock, right? And through seeing the changes in the sedimentation, you could look at the different ages of time and get somewhat of an idea of what life was like in terms of climate, in terms of how wet it was, etc. All right. From there, did he go immediately into plants? Or sorry, he did go immediately into plants, right? Not to animals. So he studied a lot of different types of plants, right? Yeah. He also studied sea urchins extensively. I don't know if you remember that. Just another little tidbit there. But just highly fascinated with all of this, and then found a way for all of this information that he was gathering to really fit together. As was said in the first group, when Origin of the Species was published, it was met with, a lot of people were astonished by it and thought it was a revolutionary work, which it was, but there was also a lot of pushback because it pushed back against the idea that God had created the world, and that was a problem for lots of people. So let's look on this PowerPoint here as we finish up the chapter. So the Origin of the Species dealt almost exclusively with plants and animals, debate raging over the text. The debate was, are human beings a separate and special creation of God, or are they descended from apes? Huxley was an expert in primate anatomy, and he was one of Darwin's staunch defenders when it came to natural selection, so do be familiar with Huxley. He's also mentioned in the textbook. In 1861, there are two scientific discoveries that I want you to examine in our book that further advance the case for evolution. So this was going on, right? Remember, Wallace was around also at the time looking at evolution. Okay. The Descent of Man argued that humans descended from animal ancestors. Darwin noted there were a lot of structural similarities between humans and other mammals, and that these similarities had to do with things like the way that bone was constructed, the way that muscle grew, what tissue looked like, even the structure of the brain, right? Now, smaller animals, more primitive animals, generally had smaller brains, but as you went up the proverbial food chain, you would see those brains grow. And he also noted that we share a lot of diseases with animals, which means we've got to share a lot of the content inside, right? We also possess certain rudimentary organs and something he called vestigial organs. So what's a vestigial organ? Have you heard that term before?
It's an organ that doesn't really have a use anymore, basically.
So at one time it served a purpose, right? But over time it no longer serves that purpose, and so it basically removes itself from the evolutionary chain. Okay, good. All right, Darwin tried to show that there were no big fundamental differences between man and higher mammals in their mental faculties. So toward the end of that video, the person who is discussing animal qualities like courage and kindness, he said, you know, this is not just something that we see in human beings. We see like lions being courageous, right? We see animals being kind to one another. We also see, like in dogs, they share many of the same emotions as man: pride, shame, jealousy. If your dog has done something it's not proud of, right, what will it usually do? It snuck some food it wasn't supposed to. Kind of cowers away, all right, may run and hide, may do this, and kind of just look up at you with its eyes. Yeah. Animals also demonstrate a great deal of memory, attention, and curiosity. And those were arguments that Darwin gave to support his claims. Okay, The Descent of Man was a pretty powerful book, and that touched on the subject of race and gender. And I want us to look in the book for just a moment here. On page 226. If you'd like to follow along, I'm at the bottom of the page. It says, the Victorian period in Britain was notable for extreme differences in attitudes and beliefs about race and the causes of ethnic differences. So people were definitely not on the same page, so to speak. Believers in polygenesis argued that non-European savage people represented a distinctly different species of being. So these people are actually different beings than Europeans. All right, you'll need to know that for the exam. That's polygenesis, with poly meaning many, M-A-N-Y.
This was in contrast to the supporters of monogenesis, which was the belief in common ancestry, right? And that all human groups were related. Even though, of course, we see observed differences, even though we see differences, it doesn't mean that we're not related. Although Darwin accepted that there was this biological unity of all people, he did believe that exposure to diverse environments would create different selection pressures among various groups, which may contribute to how tan a person becomes, right? Because that has to do with melanin, which has to do with the amount of sunlight that you receive. Perhaps in certain areas of the world, how tall a person is. Okay, his ideas on sexual selection were met in various ways. In the video, it talks about the fact that sexual selection is the gradual selection and evolution of characteristics that are specifically favorable for reproductive success. We looked at the example of the birds, and if we look at male and female birds, which birds tended to have more plumage and colors? Okay, and what was the reasoning behind that was given in the video?
It's like sexual display.
So a way to attract a mate, that those were certain markings, those were sorts of ways of being that were attractive, and then they would mate together with one another. You also talked about the human example, like in the way that we choose to dress, that might be a way of attracting mates, and he talked about that. This was more controversial. Complementarity of the sexes, it's hard to say. Women and men have evolved to have different but complementary psychological characteristics. And here he goes the way of many different people, where he has some good thoughts about things, but maybe takes them a little bit too far. So if we can read along on page, let's see, page 228. It says, complementarity of the sexes was the widely held belief that men and women have evolved to have different but complementary psychological characteristics. For example, women were more likely to be virtuous, sensitive, and nurturing for roles as wives and mothers. So he's saying, based on the kind of roles that we had to inhabit, those were sort of selected for us. So we were prepackaged to be able to do those things well. Men, it was believed, were more likely to be competitive, passionate, and ambitious, suiting their roles as breadwinners, soldiers, and public leaders. Despite his apparent even-handedness in attributing some positive mental qualities to women, thank you, Darwin, he was clear on the issue of intellectual power, and says the chief distinction in the intellectual powers of the two sexes is shown by man's attaining to a higher eminence than can woman, whether requiring deep thought, reason, or imagination, or merely the use of the senses and hands. All right, so like most of the people during that time who were his Victorian counterparts, he simply assumed that, generally speaking, men were superior to women, all right? And that's an outmoded concept, to say the least, but it was a concept that was very prevalent during that time. What questions do you have for me about Chapter 6 in Darwin? Any major questions? Okay. For Chapter 6, as you're reviewing, everyone, you'll definitely want to be able to talk about the video in some length. You'll also want to review the key terms. We've covered most but not all of those key terms on 239, so I want to go ahead and draw that to your attention. So anything you can think of at the moment? No? All right. We will end our class with a discussion of Galton. We're going to be talking about intelligence and individual differences in Chapter 7. Now, just want to make a note to make clear that you know you're not going to be tested over Chapter 7. You'll be tested over Chapters 4 and 6, and that exam will open next week. But I'm going to have to go ahead and start working with you on Chapter 7 and 8 because we've gotten behind because we've missed so many days. So just keep all of that in mind. Okay. It's going to be over Chapters 4 through 6, and I'll talk more about the exam in class on Thursday. Okay? All right. So this is the last thing that we'll watch.
Most famous scientists picked a thing, but a few polymaths like Aristotle and even Sina
Is that loud
picked
enough for
everything.
everyone?
Francis Galton, one of the most important thinkers of the generation after Darwin, fell into column B, hardcore. Galton was a co-founder of a range of scientific disciplines, including meteorology, psychology, forensics, and above all, statistics. He was an active member of the influential British Association for the Advancement of Science. He made the first weather map. Mostly, though, he is remembered for something that we don't even count as science today. Galton was the father of eugenics, the idea that the gene pool of the human species could somehow be improved if certain people with different abilities didn't have kids. Where did Galton come up with such a terrible idea? Partly from the work of his half-cousin, Charles Darwin. When Darwin and Wallace proposed their theory of evolution by natural selection, it was based on observing differences produced by thousands of years of gradual changes. But we, as short-lived humans, can't observe thousands of years of evolutionary change firsthand, so it was very hard to know what to do with natural selection. In the late 1800s, no one really understood how heredity worked. But many biologists, most notably Herbert Spencer, argued that survival of the fittest applied to humans, just like other species. So they figured there must be a technical way to use that knowledge. Spencer, for example, argued against all laws that limited class conflict, which he saw as tests of fitness, including basic child labor laws. Spencer's idea, called social Darwinism, influenced a lot of people in the late 1800s, and one of them was Darwin's younger cousin, Francis Galton. Born in 1822 to a prominent Quaker family, Galton was a child prodigy. Like Darwin, Galton was largely self-taught, a gentleman of science. Also like Darwin, he never did well in school, suffered from nervous breakdowns, and traveled widely. Unlike Darwin, Galton was not a shy scholar. He was obsessed with the idea of genius, whether it was a product of good hereditary luck or learning. For Galton, as for most Victorians, nature held all the cards. He got this idea from his cousin's hit book. On the Origin of Species blew Galton's mind. After 1859, Galton focused on the social implications of Darwin's work. He argued that an organism's most important characteristics must be biological rather than shaped by environment or experience. And like Darwin, he sought evidence for his theory. The first step was to pick some trait to track over time. He selected eminence, which today you might think of as basically awesomeness. Galton thought that if human traits can be inherited, then tracking the descendants of obviously eminent men, and of course they were men, should show a decreasing level of eminence over time as intermarriage with non-eminent people diluted this trait. So he gathered all of the historical evidence he could on eminent British men and their descendants, and indeed found that eminence seemed to decrease over time. The resulting book, Hereditary Genius, published in 1869, contains the very first use of the phrase nature versus nurture. The book also, by the way, includes a chapter on eminent wrestlers of the North country. Hereditary genius popularized the practice of historiometry, or studying human traits by tracking ancestry information. But Galton knew he was barely scratching the surface on heredity. He needed more evidence, so he did what his cousin would have done. He turned to a model from nature. This time, twins and peas instead of pigeons and barnacles. In 1875, in the paper The History of Twins, he proposed studying twins, which he saw as a natural experiment. By the mid-1900s, twin studies became the foundation of behavioral genetics, or how heredity affects behavior. Galton realized that twins presented a natural experiment. If nature is more powerful than nurture, then twins should be more similar than not, even if they're raised apart. But if nurture is more powerful, then twins should behave differently when raised apart. Galton didn't conduct his own twin studies, but he did outline what future research should look like. Galton also developed statistical methods to research inheritance, and in doing so, he created the quantitative science of human behavior. Thought bubble, show us how. Galton also started breeding sweet peas, comparing the sizes of the offspring of different seeds. Galton's work with peas led him to conclude that traits tend toward a statistical average. Galton couldn't figure out why, but he could use statistics to model the general pattern of how traits treated over time, in this case, in a normal distribution, a bell curve. In 1884, Galton took his pea model to the International Health Exhibition in London. Visitors to his anthropometric lab paid to have Galton measure their bodies, minds, and senses in various ways. He produced many new instruments in order to measure, for example, eyesight. Visitors received the results, and Galton also kept a copy to add to his library of research on variation in humans. This practice, known as anthropometry, or literally measuring humans, became common across many disciplines. Galton also pioneered the use of fingerprinting in forensics. He classified the features that we still look for: loops, whorls, and arches. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So Galton built on Darwin's work to invent a statistical science of life. But now it gets weird and frankly difficult, because Galton decided that based on his investigations on inheritance, good traits such as genius and morality were diluted down to some norm over time. In 1883, 1 year after Cousin Chuck passed away, Galton published Inquiries into Human Faculty and Its Development, in which he coined the term eugenics, the discipline of good breeding, or literally making good families in humans. Galton was not the first person to suggest that smart people should have kids with each other, or that cousins should avoid marrying. What Galton did was argue, based on what he saw as scientific evidence, for the public to do something about these ideas. He wanted families of merit to grow, and he thought the government should incentivize this growth. This was called positive eugenics. Galton pointed out that many well-born Victorians married late and had few kids compared to the lower classes. If this fear of the weakening of supposedly good stock by new or poor or different people sounds familiar, that's partly because Galton's so-called science of eugenics quickly gained traction. The first International Congress of Eugenics was held in 1912, the year after Galton died, and it was around this time that nations began passing eugenical laws, particularly the United States. Driven by a fear that births of supposedly inferior people would lead to weak or criminally degenerate adults, some states introduced forcible sterilization laws starting in 1907. These were mostly used to justify the sterilization of already incarcerated groups and those with different abilities. This was negative eugenics, which was not something Galton had explicitly argued for. The metaphor used by eugenicists was drawn from Darwin but modified. A family or nation was a tree, and its branches sometimes needed pruning. A famous example of this thinking in the United States was psychologist Henry Goddard's 1912 book about a family from New Jersey called the Kallikaks. This was a made-up name for a real family whose genealogy Goddard studied to understand what he called feeble-mindedness or intellectual disability. In the book, Goddard compared the branch of the Kallikak family that was descended from its founding father's legitimate marriage and the branch that descended from that father's affair with a, quote, nameless, feeble-minded girl. Goddard concluded that feeble-mindedness was strongly heritable and a danger to democracy. Although he later admitted that this was a flawed study, it was a hit, and his terms for different levels of intelligence became common: moron, imbecile, idiot. Goddard's attempts to quantify intelligence weren't at the fringes of science. His ideas are creepily still with us in the form of intelligence quotient, or IQ tests. Goddard, who was a big-time fan of Galtonian eugenics, translated the work of 3 major French psychologists in 1910. This translation was picked up by Louis Terman at Stanford University, who adapted the work of the French to create the Stanford-Binet intelligence scales in 1916. Goddard and Terman then worked with Robert Yerkes to develop an IQ test for the U.S. Army in 1917. The U.S. Army introduced aptitude tests to place soldiers in different roles, but the tests were highly discriminatory, privileging white candidates from educated backgrounds. This trial of the test showed very low results for non-Northern European whites and non-whites. Goddard spent much of the rest of his life publicizing these results, even though they were contested in his own day as shoddy science. There were so many other serious Galton-inspired scientists who did creepy research on human difference and argued for terrible policies. We could do a whole creepy spin-off show. Instead, let's just talk about some of the worst. A lawyer and zoologist named Madison Grant wrote a book called The Passing of the Great Race in 1916, citing Galton. Grant subdivided Caucasians into 3 types, claiming that the great Nordics were being rapidly outbred in the United States by inferior types of whites. Meanwhile, Charles Davenport, a very influential zoologist, founded the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in 1910. He collected data to help people check whether a potential marriage was suitable, and maybe unsurprisingly, Davenport was a fan of the Nazis, but probably the eugenicist most well known to us today was the nurse who coined the term birth control and opened the first U.S. birth control clinic in 1916, Margaret Sanger. Sanger founded the American Birth Control League to educate people about safe abortion procedures and contraceptives. She gave lectures on birth control to many groups, including the KKK in 1926. In the 1920s and 30s, Sanger thought that eugenics would give her movement legitimacy. By the late 1920s, eugenics had been recognized as bad science by most practicing biologists. But as a source of policy for many lawmakers in the United States, Germany, and elsewhere, eugenics was still very much alive. In the 1800s, science had become much more important for states. They wanted to understand their populations, and now shape them. Compulsory sterilization was challenged in the U.S. Supreme Court in 1927 in the famous Buck v. Bell case. But the decision, written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., sided with the eugenicists and has never technically been overturned. In fact, forced sterilization was still happening in California prisons until it was banned in 2014. Did Galton think that studying human difference would lead to bad science and even worse laws? Not necessarily. But in some ways, his legacy, a legacy of comparing humans quantitatively, is still with us. Next time, we'll see what's going on in a less creepy area of the life sciences. It's time for Pasteur, Koch, and the birth of microbiology. Crash Course History of Science is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney studio in Missoula, Montana, and it's made with the help of all of these nice
Eugenics turned racist really fast.
Eugenics turned racist really fast, okay? And this U is supposed to stand for good, right? All right. Hey,
Racist and classist.
lots of is, right? Just say that. Other things. Did they mean to go here? We hope not.
I think to a certain extent, yes, but it was a belief in kind of the, anything you can do, I can do it better type of thing.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So I don't think he was deliberately trying to, let's say, just the skin color,
Uh-huh.
of non-white, anybody else makes them inferior, but at the same time, like, he kind of believed it and just kind of, hey, like, we have this color skin because along with the other group of intelligence, like it kind of comes in one package type thing. So
So
yes and
again,
no.
confirmation bias, right? Yeah. What does this remind you of that we studied several weeks ago?
Phrenology.
It ties right into that, right? And so this idea, all of this work that came out, Darwin's legacy, it started to get a little bit twisted, and all of a sudden we end up in eugenics land, which is not a great place to be. So that's where we'll start on Thursday. In the meantime, something I want you to think about is your own conceptualization of intelligence. Chapter 7 talks about the nature of individual differences, and within that, there's a big discussion on intelligence. So some items you might consider is, how do you define intelligence? Do you think you can demonstrate it in many ways? Or do you think it can be whittled down to a few, just a few ways or a few methods can capture intelligence? So just be thinking along those lines. If you have any questions, feel free to come up and ask me. Otherwise, I think that we are finished with class for the day. Thank you.